It's your World War III update. So I hope you took my advice a long time ago and you went and got yourself some silver. Because, oh boy, are people regretting selling at $50. You remember I was criticizing all the old geezers who were like, oh my God, it's $50. We better sell. This has never happened to us before. It's happening, you fools. It's happening. This is it. This is the moment you've been preaching about for years and years. The system is done. It's cooked. Japan is finished. The average age of a Japanese person is 50 years old. Their debt to GDP ratio is 240 effing%. Their bond yields are rising because their currency is in the pisser. This system is coming undone. After this holiday, I guarantee you it's going to turn into civil war. Because whether it's identity politics or whether it's the socioeconomic divide, they're going to do whatever they can to get you fighting with one another so they can take whatever remains and roll out the killer humanoid robots. Guys, listen, I've been straight with you from the start. I told you, to my own detriment 1 year ago, sitting in this chair, I told you that Donald Trump ain't going to end the war. And what do we have happening today? Russia committing $166 billion in Russian money. Okay, well, in terms of Russian spending, as in not bloated, wasteful spending like we do here in the West with our military-industrial complex, which is not to say there's not corruption in Russia, but $166 billion in Russia. You know that the Kremlin is going to be auditing that very sharply. And you know that most of that money, what they're going to get for that $166 billion is probably what we're going to get for our $1.1 trillion. When I say our, I say the United States, because we, the Canadians, are tethered to that sinking vessel that is the United States economy. So the Russians are going to spend a record $166 billion. Putin shows up today. On the day, or the day before, I think it was today, that he was supposed to meet with Witkoff. It's probably currently in process because it's tomorrow in Moscow. He was supposed to meet with Vladimir Putin. Well, Putin shows up, military fatigues once again, and he says, you know what? I think because the price of silver is up. No, he didn't say that. He said that we're going to take another 4 oblasts. Didn't really say that either. However, he did say that they want a buffer zone. Now, back earlier in the year, I think it was May in 2025, and I think it was even mentioned prior to that, they were talking about creating a buffer zone in the oblasts which border Russia and Ukraine. This, of course, on the same day that you have Zaluzhny, the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, talking about nuclear weapons. And now that's in the discourse. Ukraine getting nuclear weapons. And the Russians are taking that seriously. They're now of the belief that the Ukrainians are actively pursuing nuclear weapons. Anyways, this is huge because within those 4 oblasts is one of the biggest cities in Ukraine, which is Kharkov or Kharkiv. Depending on, if you're Ukrainian or Russian, they have a different way of saying it. I'm probably not even saying it correctly. But you get the point. So what this means is that here we are thinking that we're talking about territorial concessions. And Putin's talking about annexing even more territory. Now, he's not saying that, but you understand, in order to have a buffer zone, you have to have a heavily militarized zone, a zone which is purged of any potential threat. And that means pushing the Ukrainians back from their border, creating a demilitarized zone along the border. Now, that's just the start because there's still the issue of the Donbass. The Ukrainians are deeply embedded in the Donbass still. Some of their most fortified lines still exist in the Donbass, which, as I'm belaboring this point lately, but it's worth repeating, the Donbass has $7 trillion worth of natural resource wealth from oil, gas, coal, rare earth minerals, more than all of the rest of Europe combined. And this is why Europe's plan to balkanize not only that part of what is now considered Russian territory by the Russians, but Russia proper, okay? Because without it, because of their demographic crisis, because of the fact that they're heavily in debt, and because they have no natural resources, they have no option now. They've shot themselves in the foot. Because as much as I believe that the Russians are businessmen, I don't think they're going to commit to massive investments like Nord Stream ever again when it currently is rusting away at the bottom of the ocean. So Putin today comes out and says, in response to Zelensky proposing nuclear weapons, well, we think it's necessary to create a so-called security zone in Ukraine along the border with Russia, within the area of responsibility in the Northern Command. So this is going to basically be from the corner of Belarus that borders Russia and Ukraine all the way down to where Russia currently has territory in the Donbass, to basically close that gap in their defenses. In practical terms, this means an attempt to expand control over the border regions of Kharkiv, Sumy, and Cherniv. Along the entire line of conflict of the special military operation, the initiative is completely in the hands of the Russian armed forces, they claim. This is why Ukraine is now expanding the conflict. And Turkey's President Erdogan had to make a statement about this today, because there have been 3 ships now, 3 Russian Shadow Fleet oil tankers that have now been targeted. One, I think, sunk or was sinking. 2 of the other ones were hit by very high explosive drones. The other one, I'm not sure exactly what happened to it, but it also was an act of sabotage. It's not a coincidence that it's going to sink. You could see it on camera. It was sinking. I don't know if it sunk or if just, one compartment or chamber, however it's designed, sunk. Either way, Erdogan came out today and said it is becoming evident that the war between Russia and Ukraine has reached a point where it clearly threatens navigational safety in the Black Sea. This is through the Bosphorus Strait that Turkey controls. This controls access from the Mediterranean, I believe, to the Black Sea. Okay? Now, this is important because this could potentially trigger a greater NATO presence in that region. Turkey, of course, is in possession of nuclear weapons. Poland is 100% going to be getting nuclear weapons because they're going to be taking delivery of the delivery platform, which will be the F-35. And if you have that platform, then you effectively, at a moment's notice, could have a nuclear weapon. And if they're just down the street in Turkey, well, then it's not hard to think. And Erdogan is a duplicitous scumbag who will basically do and say whatever the situation calls for in order to appease, whether it's Putin or, people talk about how duplicitous the Russians are. Well, Turkey, you might as well write a contract on a wet paper napkin. It's about as good as Erdogan's word to anybody. The oil tanker was sinking recently off the coast of Senegal. So in addition to the 2 that were hit in and around Turkey's territorial waters, we had one go down in Senegal. In August, it visited the Russian port of Taman, from where it headed to Togo. It entered the port, stayed for several hours, then departed with its cargo. So they suspect that there is some shadow fleet targeting going on in international waters. And this is huge because in addition to all of this, in addition to Ukraine's expansion of the conflict, I hope that me going in and out like this isn't drastically altering the microphone. I suspect that it probably is. I apologize. I'm going to have to get used to speaking robotically and staying like this if I continue with this nonsense. NATO today is talking about doing a preemptive strike on Russia. Now, it's slightly taken out of context. NATO recently floated a plan to do cyber attacks and engage in other low-intensity forms of aggression towards Russia in an attempt to interdict their advance in Ukraine. People are misconstruing this as the decapitation strike hypothesis that I've floated for many years, which is clearly what NATO is positioning itself to do. Now, they wouldn't advertise that, and Russia is aware of that, and I think the only reason why Russia is so calm, cool, and collected throughout this entire thing is that Vladimir Putin has some good intelligence on what we're going to do next. He's got somebody bugged, or they got somebody doing really good espionage work in certain places, because I think otherwise the Russians might be sweating at this point. Think about how many oil refineries have been hit, how many ammunition depots, how many red lines have been pushed back. Now they're targeting the shadow fleet and the sanctions, and now spending a record $166 billion next year. Now, what that's going to do in Russia, as an aside, is create their own dependency on a war-like economy. It becomes a certain type of Keynesian militarism, in a sense, where the economy depends on military expansion, and thus all the people in those occupations, in order to keep jobs, well, you need to justify that by maintaining a war. So this is why, this is another motivation, although many people on the pro-Russia camp would disagree with this, that Russia doesn't want war, but it might be one of those situations whereby now that their economy is so heavily entwined into a war mobilization, there may be incentive there to continue that. And that's not to say there's not some corruption, maybe not as much in the sense of, not even so much corruption in the U.S. It is corruption, but it's just, paying $80 for a little bolt or a nut or something like that, right? So that's the kind of corruption that you deal with in the United States, the Halliburton overcharging for certain things, military contractors milking it. In Russia, I'm sure they have similar problems, but I suspect that they're a lot more frugal. So that's basically what's going on with the buffer zone. There was this idea floated by the former commander of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Zaluzhny, that the Ukrainians should be entitled to get nuclear weapons, that's their only guarantee against further Russian aggression. Now, ultimately, in some way, shape, or form, that will be what security guarantees amount to, because a security guarantee ultimately has to have a nuclear component, whether it is some bilateral arrangement between Ukraine and one other country, maybe it's France, or it's a multilateral agreement between all of NATO, which effectively amounts to an Article 5, which is what Ukraine is pushing for. The problem with that comes in whether or not Ukraine does something to provoke a response from the Russians, and then NATO is obligated to respond on the basis of that perceived aggression. So we could quickly, this is why NATO doesn't want to give any written agreements. Not that I think that we necessarily would abide by it anyways. I mean, Article 5 can be implemented rather arbitrarily, and it doesn't really, just because the way it's written, it's loosely worded and it's open to interpretation, that the nations within NATO should come to the aid, not must come to the aid, or if they must, to what degree, right? So there's different ways to interpret it. So with respect to the nuclear question, Lindsey Graham surprisingly rejected the idea. But we need to understand about this, because the Tomahawks were the penultimate, and then the nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapon. That's what they eventually want to get to. And I think I've even stated as much on this channel before. Ultimately, they want to give Ukraine nukes, because that's the ultimate guarantee. Now, that would likely guarantee Ukraine's destruction. And I doubt that they would be too concerned without sacrificing Ukraine. However, they do want all those resources. So if Ukraine does have some nuclear guarantee, it has to be a very formidable one. It can't just be a handful of nukes. It needs to be a lot. It needs to be something that would pose an existential threat to the Russians. Now, surprisingly, Lindsey Graham came out with a post today actually rejecting the idea of nuclear weapons to Ukraine, if you can believe it. But I think this was cleverly orchestrated, because what they're trying to do is introduce this into the discourse, okay? In order to get you to accept anything, you first have to bring the idea into the discourse and see what the response is. Because the Trump administration has been talking about nuclear tests, and everybody is so distracted with, infighting over identity politics, or this Venezuela circus. You got people who actually believe. And I mean, the propaganda is on a whole other level right now. Listen, everything you're hearing about Venezuela, 90% of it is probably just made up bullshit. Today, you have Maduro dancing on the stage in front of hundreds, if not thousands of people with clear lines of sight for any sniper who would want to take him out. And you have these stories coming out on Reuters, which are from anonymous White House officials, the usual suspects, who are indicating that Maduro was pleading for his life so that him and his family could flee the country. They do the same shit to try to sow discord and to try to, demoralize the people in the country. It's all nonsense. And you have this thing now where I was reading it. MAGA is suggesting certain elements of MAGA. Obviously, I'd say the majority of MAGA doesn't want a war. But there's certain elements, and I think these are mostly these bot accounts that are highly influential. They get a lot of amplification on Twitter and or X. And it was trying to say that Venezuela rigged the 2020 election. I mean, the most preposterous things, and people just gobble it up, right? People just eat it up, and people think it's going to be a walk at the park. And Venezuela, let me just tell you something about Venezuela. If you think that you're going to go in there and you're going to start pumping oil and you're going to build out all of this infrastructure, meanwhile, one guerrilla warfighter with a drone can effectively incapacitate and deactivate an oil refinery, an oil well, any bottleneck in the supply chain. How are you going to get insurance for that? Okay, they could easily make it an untenable situation through guerrilla warfare tactics if they wanted to. And that's a nation which has a long history of, socialism and communism. So there's some hard-line ideologues in that society who will fight things from the perspective of this is an ideology that we represent from a cultural point of view, not even because they're being told to. So I think people are actually drastically underestimating Venezuela's, not their, peer-to-peer capability. But if it comes down to a guerrilla war and you get, soldiers coming in from other countries, then it's not going to go as planned. What they're banking on is a swift decapitation strike. If they can achieve that, if Maduro has really poor hygiene, digital hygiene, and if he doesn't have a suitable successor that's going to carry the torch, then maybe it'll be a swift victory. But if they don't have that, then it's not going to be easy. And it's going to be very easy to disrupt military operations unless you're paying people off. And some people, you can't pay off. Now, they've been able to pull it off in places like Syria and Iraq, although they try and they do successfully attack those places. It is still obviously a business that I think a lot of that infrastructure was maybe built out during times when it was a little bit better. In a war environment, in this current environment, I don't know, but I suspect that's an angle that not a lot of people are thinking about. Okay, so anyways, Lindsey Graham, going back to the Russia nuclear thing, Lindsey Graham rejects the idea. And again, it's just to prime you to the idea. They want the conversation to now be, well, nuclear weapons, probably a stretch too far. But those tomahawks, that's starting to seem more reasonable now. Okay, the sanctions are supposed to start to be biting Russia right now. You got all this talk of war in the East with China, okay, and Japan, because you have a very provocative and inflammatory Japanese prime minister now who's provoking the Chinese and the island chains around Taiwan. Russia today said, you know what? We're going to grant all 1.4 billion Chinese people visa-free travel back and forth. And I think they're working on something similar for work permits with India to make up for whatever sort of shortfall they have in human resources as a result of the war. So while the Russians are weaker in a sense because the sanctions are stinging, they've been hit pretty hard in terms of their refinement capacity, even though they'll downplay it. Inflation is still through the roof. Obviously, it's much harder for them to conduct global trade. Everything they're doing off the books on the black market through places like Kazakhstan and their other satellite territories. So eventually, it's going to take its toll. I think this $166 billion number is somewhat of a front. It's there to make it seem as though they're indomitable economically, when the reality is they're probably not doing that great, especially with the price of oil so low. And if the East completely gets ejected from the South America with the Monroe Doctrine back in full swing, then that could potentially limit their strategic options and put them at a great disadvantage in the coming Day X scenario, where you would almost want to have some land-to-land based, surface-to-surface based missile delivery platforms that you could potentially target Washington faster, even though they got nuclear submarines that could, be in the Atlantic somewhere and probably take out Washington, fast enough. But they're at an unfair advantage. Nothing's fair, but they're at a disadvantage because NATO has a lot of nukes very close to their borders and potentially going to be in Ukraine as well, by the sounds of things. So again, this whole thing is just to move the goalpost of the conversation so that anything that falls up under a lower level of severity compared to nuclear weapons, things like Tomahawk missiles or longer range missile platforms, more advanced fighter jets and things of that nature, will seem permissible in relation relative to the nuclear weapon question. Now, the State Duma, Gurlev, the deputy chair of the State Duma, responded to NATO's threat about doing this preemptive strike. And here's what he had to say, and this is very revealing stuff. This shows you that at a very high level, the Russians are taking seriously the prospect of NATO actually trying to do a decapitation strike, because they understand the gravity of the situation. They understand that they're in possession of like 99% of the vital resource wealth that's on the European continent, and almost none of the debt, and that the Europeans are frothing at the mouth with respect to the possibility of getting their hands on that. I have repeatedly noted, he claims, this is the State Duma chair, deputy chair, that Western structures call the dates of possible conflict with Russia between 2028 and 2030. This is when the European countries are saying, we're going to go to war with Russia by 2028. This is not a prediction of the date of the Russian attack, but an element of strategic planning. The growth of military budgets, mobilization programs of Germany, France, and other countries, discussions on the deployment of nuclear weapons to Poland, and now on Ukraine, is part of the long-term architecture of confrontation. So here the Russians acknowledge that this is not some pie-in-the-sky idealistic notion that they're going to put nukes in Ukraine. This is a serious conversation that's being had at the highest level. European elites see war with Russia as the only way to maintain their own political and economic viability. If they don't attack now, it's only for two reasons. European society is not ready for war, and the Russian nuclear triad guarantees unacceptable consequences for them. At the same time, no one in Russia has no illusions that it will be able to go through this without losses, talking about nuclear reprisal. Losses are inevitable. This is a part of reality. But another thing is inevitable. Any structure that decides to strike Russian land or population will lose the opportunity to continue to exist as a military or political unit. This is not a threat, but a consequence of algorithms that will be activated automatically. So, is he referring to dead hand? Is he just referring to their DEFCON equivalent protocol, that it's non-negotiable, that should an attack come that's in a conventional form, is there an immediate trigger to go to the nuclear level? Because they're saying they have no intention of fighting NATO directly. Because, and this is kind of the contradiction I hear in a lot of Russian circles, They claim, well, we can't take on all of NATO conventionally, but at the same time, they talk about how weak NATO is. Now, I'm sure somebody can reconcile that into a reasonable proposition, but I think there's maybe a little bit of truth to both of that. If they are able to successfully conquer Ukraine, and if they have all the resources, if they incorporate whatever Ukrainian population, because a lot of people say, oh, the Russian population is declining now because of the war. But if they're absorbing the Ukrainian population, and it's the Ukrainians who actually want to be a part of Russia, let's say they annex all 8 of these oblasts, and they incorporate 10 million people into their population. That's a large amount of human resources. If you have the Chinese and the Indians working in different industrial capacities within the economy, that frees up more troops. So Russia could potentially train an army of 10 million people to compete with NATO, and they would have the resources to do so. Once the whole fiat-based debt bubble goes tits up, I mean, Europe is potentially screwed if the euro tanks and people lose confidence in those currencies because they realize there's nothing there to back it up, right? They have gold. Sure, Germany, France, the UK. Well, I guess the UK has other people's gold. I think they have a bit of their own too. And many other countries in Europe are trying to catch up. That's really all they have is their gold. So, at the end of the day, that's why a lot of people suspect that when the system crashes, that amount of gold, that all assets will be denominated with whatever gold remains because currencies will be completely worthless. That means when this shit hits the fan, if there's 100,000 tons of gold in the world, you take all the assets that exist on the planet or things that are deemed to have value to human beings, and that'll all be equally proportionally denominated in gold. Some people say this could send the price of gold to $40,000 an ounce. I think it's never a bad time to buy gold, and I don't think that right now the valuations that you are seeing are due to any sort of FOMO. And that is the thing that people need to realize. There's people who might be reluctant to get into the gold game. This is not financial advice, but just think about this for a sec. Gold is on a run, really in the absence of any mainstream media publicity. It's because of all these wars. It's because all of these countries that have aging populations that will never be able to pay back their debts, they're trying to cash in that fiat for gold. If you're Japan right now and you know that the yen is potentially about to get cooked, why wouldn't you take some of that yen and convert it into hard assets while you still can? Okay, so this is where the race happens and the hyperinflationary cycle potentially begins, not just in yen, but in all currencies. And this is only going to intensify as tensions rise. So oil might be cheap right now, but in an instant, man, the planet uses 100 million barrels of oil a day. Okay, it's actually up to 110 million, and that's just in the past year. It's up like 6 or 7%. So 110 million barrels per day. If there is just a shortfall of maybe 10 million barrels because too many Russian shadow fleet vessels get sunk, and that is suppressing prices. If there is a shortfall because maybe this thing in Venezuela doesn't go so well. If there's a shortfall because what the Iranians are preparing for, there was some clashes recently over the weekend. The Iranians deny that they were targeting sites in Kurdistan. But anyways, the idea is that the war could potentially flare up there as well. And we could easily see a shortfall of 10 million barrels of oil a day. Okay? So energy is cheap now. But the reason why it's so cheap is because they know shit's going to hit the fan. So they want to get it as low as they possibly can so that when it does hit the fan, then the sting isn't so hard, right? And you got to ask yourself, well, why are groceries still high? Is it all just gouging? Why is the price of everything else so high? It's because, by and large, I suspect that energy prices are being artificially suppressed. The actual value of the oil, you're getting at a discount because there's a price war going on that is trying to destroy Russia. It's trying to get Russia out of the market to the point where it's not profitable. And they're trying to destroy their industry because they think that that's the fastest way to not only destroy the Russian Federation, but also take out their primary adversary, which is the Chinese, who are wholly dependent on Russian natural resources and energy. So I would be very cautious at this point in time believing anything that the Western media says about, countries, It was just like during the Iran conflict, they were trying to sow all kinds of discord because that's what you do. You want to sow chaos. You want to make it think like there's no leadership. All the leaders are dead and they're running scared and it's total anarchy. And you want to be pumping that into the country to create instability and demoralize people and hopefully have them try to overthrow the government themselves. So you're going to be hearing all kinds of bullshit about Venezuela. And just remember how the Iraq War started, or one of the casus bellis was that testimony of that little girl who claimed that the Iraqi soldiers, she put on a great show, right? It was all bullshit. And most of it was bullshit, as we come later to find. And we've seen that on October 7th. There was a lot of things that were made up that didn't actually happen. But she said something about, I think, Iraqi soldiers going into hospitals, going into the incubators and killing the babies, stuff like that. Like the most heinous crimes you could imagine, pulling on people's heartstrings so that they, use those emotional appeals to justify a war. It's the exact same thing they're doing. The reasons that they're giving you is bullshit. Narco-terrorists, okay? And now Pete Hegseth threw one of his generals under the bus. It's no surprise that the leader of the, Southern Command, he resigned. Remember? He resigned like a couple months ago because he's like, man, he knew that they were going to hang him out to dry, just like Hegseth did today. Oh, well, it wasn't us who gave the kill order. It was this guy. And then they're bragging about it. The hubris, the arrogance, the pride, it's going to backfire immensely. This is going to backfire. If there were to, if there was a justifiable reason, if Venezuela was even in the top 10 of drug traffickers, which they aren't, if they were, getting ready to be a staging ground for, Russian nuclear missiles or something like that, maybe there's, secret intelligence on that they're not telling. I don't know. But the reasons they're giving you are complete bullshit. Now, they rigged the 2020 election. It's going to be some other dumb thing, right? But what it's going to amount to is a massive immigration crisis because it's going to have knock-on effects in other parts of South America, which are going to be highly disruptive and destabilizing economically. And when you have economic destabilization, you have people who get displaced, dislocated. They got nowhere to go. You can build the wall as high as you want. They're going to find a way over. They're going to start coming over in boats. Okay? So that's what's going to happen. And it's just going to make the problem worse. And right now, people are just blood drunk for no reason, really. They don't even understand. Like, Mexico's right there, trafficking in the fentanyl. They don't want to go in there because they know they probably get fucked up by the cartels. Because they're actually trained and they use, sophisticated forms of weaponry. Not that they couldn't do some damage, but it would be a Vietnam quagmire. At least maybe they think in Venezuela it's not going to be. Who knows, man? It's just all a bunch of smoke being blown, where. I think I touched on all the points. It's not too late to buy gold. It's not too late to buy silver. And, Pam Bondi reminded us today that now they're going to use, and this is what I mean, man. The Charlie Kirk assassination was a tragedy. I don't agree with Charlie Kirk on everything, but I liked his approach. I did like his approach, even though I think he should have debated some higher level intellectuals. That's neither here nor there. But they're going to milk these catastrophes to the greatest extent possible for the purpose of militarizing the homeland, because they got to get you ready for World War III. So Pam Bondi today comes on and says, we're going to roll out the National Guard to every city now. And they're going to use the deaths and the casualties from the recent attack as justification to do so, or additional. Now, a lot of people are going to say, hey, well, we like the fact that there's less crime. I don't disagree with that. This crime is getting out of control. I guess part of the problem with it, and I totally understand that you need a corporal element to societal rehabilitation, but it doesn't address the underlying issues, and usually the problem just metastasizes somewhere else. So how long are you going to keep the troops on the streets? And does the problem just reemerge once you take them off? And becoming accustomed to having the military in the streets, that's a double-edged sword. I'm not going to get into. I've already made a video on why that's very dangerous, and why there was a time when alternative media talking heads, that was their whole shtick, talking about posse comitatus and martial law and the threat of martial law. And now they've gone radio silent on the issue. But just be careful. Be very careful, because right now they're doing everything they can to provoke and divide us. That's what they're trying to do. While everybody's broke, automation is taking all the jobs, and we're going to be obsolete in terms of our human resource potential very soon. They know it. The clock is ticking, and we're not even fully realizing artificial general intelligence yet. Although once they have it, we're not going to know for a few months later for national security purposes. In fact, I would suspect, based on the average IQ of people, we probably hit AGI 5 years ago by that metric. But I would suspect that they already have it, or they're getting very, very close to legitimate ASI, artificial superintelligence, the ability to do recursive learning, where the machine will render better versions of itself at light speed, and things, the takeoff point, the singularity. I think they're very close to that, and they wouldn't tell us. They wouldn't give it to you. They're not going to give it to you to enhance your tweets or enhance your emails and stuff. They're not going to give that to you to make stupid videos with. No. They're going to keep the good stuff for themselves. Just like the military is many years ahead of us in terms of technological capability and is at the frontier of most scientific discovery. The same will be the case with the Genesis project that I talked about last week, whereby they're going to be throwing billions upon billions. And it's, of course, a crypto bailout of sorts, not of cryptocurrency, but a secret bailout of AI, because it's going to effectively put up billions of dollars for chips to an industry which is still unprofitable by all metrics, and probably won't be for a long time until they start putting these chips in some kind of useful hardware in the form of robots. I agree with Elon that robots are a multi-quadrillion dollar industry at the end of the day in terms of the amount of labor that they can enable us to do. They're going to increase the potential of human work and creativity and production by leaps and bounds, orders of magnitude. I mean, the jump from the tractor, from the shovel, was like 1,000-fold increase in terms of the productivity you could get off of a liter of diesel versus what a man could do with a shovel for a day. This leap is going to be probably 1 million times, because you're talking about infinite amounts of robots, as many as we can make and power, and that's the key word, electricity. They'll find a way to do it, but it's going to raise your price of electricity. Each one of these robots is going to be able to work faster. They're going to be able to be more precise, and they're going to be able to do everything that humans do faster. And if you have a humanoid that can do everything a human can do, well, that's when they come for the trades. The first thing they're going to do is make police. That's what they want. They want robot police, because, that's the biggest hurdle for them to overcome. And I say that, right now they're promoting this, well, the robots can do all your chores, right? They can wash your floors. Well, I say if the robots can do your chores, there's a very good chance that the robots can kick in your doors. And if you don't think that those two things are going to coincide, you got another thing coming. Anyways, guys, I would hope that you would check out some of the videos we released over the weekend. We interviewed Dr. Chris Ellis, who is a researcher, military man, very well educated. I think he's got a PhD. He's got 4 master's degrees. He's done a lot of research on prepping culture, and he's got the stats. He's got the receipts to back up everything he says. And he says some very interesting things about what they discovered about who's prepping, what they're prepping for, why they're prepping, and it's fascinating stuff. So I would encourage you to go and watch that video. He wrote a book called Resilient Citizens. He also did some work with a friend of the channel, Bradley Garrett, who wrote the book Bunker, who we've interviewed in-house in the past. So Bradley Garrett performed the qualitative analysis. He went out into the field, interviewed individual preppers, and Chris did the quantitative aspect of that, where he actually, did the surveys and looked at all the data to see who exactly was prepping for what and why. Anyways, my friends, go check that out. That's on the Canadian Prepper YouTube channel. We also had some fun doing a review of the Blue Eddy series. I don't really do these a lot anymore, but they sent me a sodium battery. It's the first of its kind for the purpose of, all-in-one inverter, solar charger, battery type system. And it functions way better in cold weather. So they wanted to get one into my hand so I could try it up here in the north. And it works. It's not as dense. It's safer, but it's also cheaper. So I think Blue Eddy had a Cyber Monday sale on where they were doing like 70% off. You may still be able to get those deals. I'll post the links in the description below. And one thing I forgot to mention is that there was another internet outage for the first few hours this morning on e-commerce websites. Is that because of Cyber Monday? I don't know. I think as many people were shopping on Friday as they were on Monday, this was clearly something that was related to Shopify, Amazon Web Services. A lot of big websites were down. So it's happening more and more frequently. As we enter the AI age, AI is going to be weaponized and automate the cybersecurity threats. So always make sure you got a little bit of cash and, of course, silver and gold, baby. Thanks for watching.